Hi, my name is Leonals, and today my speech is going to be about drugs such as cocaine, meth, and heroin, and the dangers it poses to the human body, but also, more importantly, your brain. At the age of 10, there was this little girl who had parents who were both heavy drug users, but also drug addicts. At 10 years old, she lived with her mom. Her mom used drugs such as Vicodin and Percocet. Her mom also would allow her little girl to use these drugs. Using these drugs at such a young age, this little girl got very addicted to these drugs, but her mom would also tell her to use Vicodin and Percocet and mix it with alcohol. She lived with her mom for about 3 years while using Vicodin and Percocet throughout all those 3 years. At the age of 13, she finally decided to run away from home and thought it would be better if she lived with her dad. Though her dad was also a heavy drug user and drug addict, he was addicted to drugs such as meth, cocaine, and ecstasy. For 3 years living with her dad would also physically abuse her, would also allow her to use these drugs, making her being even more addicted to drugs. At the age of 16, 3 years later, she finally decided to run away from home and live on the streets. Living on the streets, she was finally picked up by cops. She was then placed in a juvenile center where the cops then realized she was going through drug withdrawals. This little girl at the age of 16 explained that these drug withdrawals were the hardest things she can ever come out of. In 2009, after being placed in a rehabilitative center for over 3 years and working along rehab therapists and other therapists, she finally was able to declare herself fully sober. She hadn't have touched a drug in 3 years. The purpose of this speech is to inform the audience how the brain copes with addictive drugs such as cocaine, meth, and heroin, and how your brain overall functions when introduced to these addictive drugs. In an article written in October of 2015, it says that over 20 million Americans face drug addictions, but only 10% of these Americans receive the proper care they need in order to be taken off of these drugs. An individual's overall brain and functions determines how your brain will react once introduced to these addictive drugs. Also, it is also good to know the effects that a drug does have on the human brain in order to help yourself with drug addictions or also help others around you that are facing these drug addictions. The National Health Institution also says that whenever an individual is using a drug, it disrupts the reward circuit within the brain that releases the dopamine that allows individuals to feel happiness and joyful over certain situations. Once a drug is introduced to this dopamine reward circuit, as they call it, the reward circuit is then damaged, and the only happiness these drug addicts are getting are truly from using the drugs, causing them to keep wanting and to keep using these drugs in order to feel happy again, and which is why these individuals become addicted to the drugs that they are using. The way the body and brain breaks down the drugs are very different than how they break down the drugs, or they break down natural things within the body. In an article written in July of 2020 by the National Institution of Health states that drugs interfere with the neurons and neuron transmitters that they receive and the signals they receive from these drugs. When a drug is released into the body, it attaches itself to a neurotransmitter in the brain that are receptive by the dopamine process. Though these neurotransmitters usually go off when there's things such as you're eating, hearing, playing music, or overall enjoying yourself, the neurotransmitters will then send off bursts of dopamine. Instead, when you're using these drugs, you can be sitting or doing nothing, using the drugs, and you're still getting that sense of joyfulness. And once you use drugs, the surge amount of dopamine that is released when you do start using drugs is way bigger than the natural ones you get from playing around or seeing friends, which is why drug addicts keep doing more and more of these so they can feel more happy, more joyful, because the body is only now getting used to large amounts of the dopamine, serotonin, and epinephrine that are released by drugs like cocaine, heroin, and meth. Though there are also certain parts within the brain that are damaged by the drugs that are more damaged than parts like the neurotransmitters or the receivers and the signals that are sent out throughout the brain. In the brain, there are 3 main components that are destroyed by drugs. The 3 main components are going to be the prefrontal cortex, which is going to be right in front, also the extended amygdala, and also the basal ganglia. The prefrontal cortex is in charge of decision making, response inhibition, planning out things. And once a drug is introduced to your prefrontal cortex, it affects your cognitive operations. It interrupts with your thinking, your decision making, and your overall functioning as a human to be functional. Your basal ganglia is in charge of their daily routines you set in your life, like getting up in the morning to go walk your dog, or also eating at a certain time, or going to work at a certain time. And once drugs is introduced to the basal ganglia, it will overactivate your ganglia, and it will make you feel so euphoric that it makes that part of your brain too sensitive to things such as eating, or your routines that you normally do are often going to be thrown off. Jeff Nuva explains that once drugs are introduced to this part of the brain, it will remove all feelings that are often seen within a normal human being. Removing feelings like this will often make people feel numb to certain things, just like in the basal ganglia, but also over time, it makes this part of the brain more sensitive, so maybe you'll become more irritable, have more anxiety, and also more depression. But also, it removes feelings like this, so it makes people not have certain feelings. When taking these drugs, individuals often think that they remove their feelings of depression and anxiety, but oftentimes this feeling only lasts for so long after taking the drug. It actually does not allow individuals to connect their mind with the feelings they are having within certain situations. And it causes individuals to continue to take these drugs in order to feel happy and not feel those certain feelings of depression and anxiety that they do not want, causing them to become more addictive and more dependent on these drugs in order to relieve the feelings of dissatisfaction that they have. The brain undergoes certain withdrawals that causes pain both physically and emotionally within the brain. An article written by the Access Recovery titled The Brain and Drug Withdrawal in 2005 explains that once individuals stop taking drugs such as meth, cocaine, and heroin, the body will have a certain change in the biochemicals, which the biochemicals are the serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine, and that it will get very hard for them to reproduce these biochemicals in a more natural way, as the only way they were receiving these biochemicals were through the drugs that they were taking on a daily basis. Once the individual abruptly stops using these drugs, there's going to be a low amount of these biochemicals such as dopamine, and the individual will start feeling very anxious or even depressed because the happiness they weren't in the euphoric feeling they were once feeling are suddenly gone and ripped away from them just because of their withdrawal process. As once before they got a sense of pleasure, they are now receiving very low amounts that are normal to normal human beings that remain drug absent, but to drug users, the level of dopamine is way lower than they once needed and once felt. Educating America on the dangers that drug poses to our community allows us to receive our happiness from our overall natural experiences that human beings occur and go through, and instead not receiving our happiness from our destroyed dopamine reward circuit that is often overwhelmed with these drugs. We are able to come to a drug-free society. Thank you for listening to my speech, and also I'm sorry if it is a little choppy. I did have to break it up a little bit because my phone kept dying and turning off in between. So